Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today for this latest conversation in our series on faith and culture. And we're deeply grateful to be joined by the distinguished author, Jonathan Franzen, and to have this opportunity to engage his work. And John, I want to thank you for being with us. It's wonderful to have you here at Georgetown, and we look forward to the reflections you'll share with us this afternoon. I also wish to extend a special welcome to Bishop Paul Elie, the Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Culture. Over the course of the past several years, as part of our ongoing partnership, we've been privileged to host a number of events on our campus with the Pontifical Council for Culture, including our three-day gathering, Courtyard of the Gentiles, Faith, Culture, and the Common Good in 2014, and Towards a New Economy, Justice, Culture, and the Social Market in 2017. As well as our most recent event in the series. So, Your Excellency, thank you for your extraordinary leadership in promoting dialogue and reflection on faith and culture, and we're honored to have you with us this afternoon. We're also deeply grateful to our moderator of the Faith and Culture series, Paul Elie, Senior Fellow at our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and Director of our American Pilgrimage Project. Through this series, now spanning almost a decade, we've had the privilege of welcoming many distinguished authors and artists to the hilltop, from Alice McDermott and Richard Rodriguez to Marilyn Robinson and Colum McCann. In recent years, we've welcomed Christian Wyman and Billy Collins. Just last year, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Martin Scorsese and Tracy K. Smith. This afternoon, we're deeply grateful to have this opportunity to include Jonathan Franzen as part of this series. Called The Great American Novelist by Time Magazine, he has the distinction of being, and I won't pronounce these correctly, let alone, but remember, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the German Academy des Künste, and the French the French Order of Arts and Letters. I did not do well in French. Mr. Franzen is the author of 5 novels, 2 collections of essays, a memoir, and an essay composed entirely in footnotes, as well as numerous essays, stories, and journalism pieces for The New Yorker and other prominent publications. His novel, The Corrections, received the National Book Award for Fiction in 2001 and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2002. Just last year, he was awarded the 3rd annual Frank Schirmacher Prize, and in this fall, he will publish his 3rd collection of essays, The End of the Earth Essays, which will be in November of this year. His most recent novel, Purity, is a New York Times bestseller and has been widely reviewed to great acclaim. As the Washington Post writes, quote, Purity demonstrates Franzen's ingenious plotting, his ability to steer the chaos of real life toward moments that feel utterly surprising yet inevitable, offering a constantly provocative series of insights, close quote. We look forward to reflecting on this extraordinary novel and the essay collection Farther Away, both of which highlight their author's skilled observation and incisive wit in just a few moments. Throughout his career, he has used his writing to engage with complex variations of our contemporary experiences and anxieties. He has examined interiority and instant gratification in the internet age, intimacy and secrecy, idealism and self-deception, as well as themes of identity, family, and conflict. He said of the role of literature, quote, save is a strong word for what literature can do, but I have felt saved by books. He continues, to happen upon a book that seems to be speaking directly to me, even though the author didn't know me, it helps. It is a truly good thing in the world that you could pick up this product that consists of paper and ink, and you can have an experience, a really deep experience of feeling less alone, close quote. This is what brings us together today. This is why we are so honored and privileged to have John with us and to have his reflections as part of our Faith and Culture series, led by Paul Elie. Before joining Georgetown, Paul spent nearly 2 decades in publishing as a senior editor with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. He is the author of 2 books, The Life You Save May Be Your Own and Reinventing Bach, as well as essays and articles for The Atlantic, The New York Times, Vanity Fair, and Commonweal. Through his writings, his projects at the Berkley Center, and his leadership of this Faith and Culture series, Paul explores religious beliefs and narratives and invites us to observe, examine, and understand the place of faith in contemporary society. So we're grateful to have him with us as moderator today, and it's now my privilege to turn this over for today's conversation, Jonathan Franzen and Paul Elie.
Thank you very much, President DeGioia, and thank you, Jonathan Franzen, for joining us today. Welcome to Bishop Ty. Glad to have you back, and it's really at your instigation that I finally pressed on with my invitation to Jonathan Franzen. We were in Rome. I was in Bishop Ty's office in the Vatican, and I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to go into the Vatican and see on the desk of a pontifical official, or whatever they call you, the London Review of Books and like publications, and then to wind up talking about Richard Ford and various Irish poets and Jonathan Franzen. When you mentioned John's work and asked whether I knew it, I was happy to be able to say that I knew the work and also have some acquaintance with the author. So that then led to this. John, thank you for being here, and thank you just for your work. I feel the way about your work the way some people feel about, say, Bruce Springsteen's or Bob Dylan's, that I was there all along and have had the satisfaction of watching an artist working at full power really throughout my adult life, and that's been a real privilege. Bought your first book in page proofs, wrote a little blurb about the second book saying that it was a large audience novel, which is a term of bellows, without the large audience. I then wrote you a letter enclosing the piece, and lo and behold, the letter came back. And why do you cringe? This is proof of your contract theory of the novel. There's writer and reader in a certain sort of relationship, right?
But I could write a pretty pompous letter back then, so
I don't think it's at all pompous. I'm growing ever more leery of mixing art and politics. Maybe you should read this.
Whoa. I'm growing ever more leery of mixing art and politics. This was not part of the contract, in both senses of that word. I know, for example, that really good journalism or essays can have every bit as much political effect as the best political fiction, but that they can't begin to render truth or the human heart the way Flannery or Faulkner or Dostoevsky can. I've been wondering lately, under the spell of certain more modest, realistic works like Paula Fox's Desperate Characters and Jane Smiley's Goodwill, whether serious fiction's survival will depend not on accommodation with its op-ed page competition, but on renewed quasi-religious dedication to the old ideas of truth and mimesis, which need not be any earth-shaking transformation, but simply a slight shift in emphasis from being about to simply being. I knew Paul was a big Flannery O'Connor fan. So that's not part of the contract to tailor, to tell the person exactly what he wants to hear. But here we are as a result of that letter, apparently.
Well, you said in the letter that you were Philly bound. From what I can make out, you then went to Philly and you spent some time with Catholic workers there?
I did. I had a, albeit not entirely distinguishable from my intense attraction to a woman who was involved with the Catholic worker, involvement with the Catholic worker. Yeah, I would say I'm one of those bad people when it comes to religion. You can kind of track. I grew up in the church. I had this astonishing, almost singular experience of a Christian youth group that wasn't particularly Christian for 6 years that I was intensely involved with. and then left that all behind when I came to literature. But in the late 80s, my life started getting hard. And that's why I say I'm not maybe a very good religious person, because you can, if I were in the little consumer data booth turning the knob, tracking very carefully with the distress in my personal life was my interest in religion. And it just like, you got to 92, 93 when my father was falling apart and my marriage was falling apart and my career seemed to be going nowhere. It was like, wow, it's like, yes, I'm actually really interested. And, you know, and then, so it's dialed back a little bit, which is to say, those two things, the childhood and adolescent experience of this not very Christian, but nonetheless extremely intense youth group, and then my later fascination with religious art and the religion that came along with that. And that was primarily four things. That was Flannery O'Connor, it was Dostoevsky, it was the Northern Gothic cathedral architecture and the Southern Gothic, late Gothic sculpture. Those four things made an impression on me, much of what's left of which is a respect for the category of spiritual experience and religious faith. And I fight with my brother, my aggressively atheist brother, about it, he's so enraged by certain things done in the name of religion and certain kinds of denial of science that it would be helpful to accept. That he's just, he really sides with the Dawkinses and the Dennetts, who are just really mean about religion. And how could any, it's like, well, Bob, it's a little more complicated than that. You know, your life has gone well, and obviously you have not had a spiritual experience, but perhaps you should not be so completely dismissive of that as a category. So I just took that and ran somewhere with it.
That's why we're here.
Okay.
So at that time...
So you caught me, okay, yes, this was all by way of saying, yes, I was in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was something. It was a bit of a personal Waterloo, Philadelphia. Worst year of my life was spent in the city of brotherly love. And I knew it was the worst year of my life, too, the whole time it was going on. But yes, that was kind of my, and because of Catholic Worker and Margaret, hanging out with a lot of really, really serious vow of poverty Catholics, and feeling in the scene at the Catholic Worker something like I hadn't felt since my own fellowship experience as a teenager. You were catching me at a moment of probably relatively high interest.
Maximum hunger.
Yeah, maximum hunger, and yeah, I was really miserable, and I was struggling rather explicitly with I need to find faith. I need to, I don't know what else to do. I have to try to be a more faithful person. I need to try to believe in something. And so that was, I have journal entries that are slightly embarrassing, as all journal entries tend to be within a year or two, but that talk about, I was shocked when I was looking back at them. I was looking for some particular piece of information. I was shocked by how explicitly Christian, almost Catholic, my own self-interrogation was. The terms of it were very, very explicitly religious. And I was like, wow.
That was coming also from immersion in Flannery O'Connor and Dostoevsky and religious art?
Well, yeah, I mean, Flannery O'Connor is one of the great American writers we'll ever see. And she was an uncompromising Catholic, to put it mildly. And Dostoevsky's, I don't know of a better novel than The Brothers Karamazov, and that is a religious undertaking. A bigger one, and Flannery herself had the image of her paddling her little boat behind the super tanker. She meant Faulkner, but in a certain way, she didn't have the grand architectural vision of Dostoevsky, but both of them were really, really seriously, and they were trying to create religious art.
And you would also, at that time, in the second novel, Strong Motion, created a fantastically memorable fundamentalist preacher in Boston who saw minor earthquakes in the area as evidence of God's wrath, and his license plate said pro-life 7 on it, and he gave a better account of the pro-life position than I'd ever heard in the Catholic Church coming out of your imagination. So you'd already been there in the sense of creating a dichotomous plot with religious people versus worldlings in that second book.
Well, and there's what I referenced in this could have been worse letter that you made me read from. I'm one of those artists who has a certain impatience with politics because of the simplifying and polarizing nature of political discourse. And so even though my sympathies were with the good liberal kids in that book, it seemed important to do what, I mean, in my own little, paddling my little boat way, do what Dostoevsky had done in Brothers Karamazov. The Grand Inquisitor was state of the art. No one had ever done a better case against the Christian Church than Dostoevsky in his religious work of art did. That was, and he did that as a truth teller, and which is to say he couldn't write a piece of propaganda because that would have just been wrong. It would have been religiously wrong, and it would have been artistically wrong. And for the same reason, I felt it was important to push back against a certain knee-jerk leftist dismissal of everything that the activist churches of that moment were saying. Plus, abortion, complicated issue. Actually, not a. It's always going to be a vexed issue. It's not a slam dunk for either side. It's going to be, you get to one extreme or the other, it's going to be pretty clear unless you're a real absolutist, real hardliner. But for most people, there's going to be, yes, on the one hand, on the other hand, stuff in the middle. And that's, of course, an interesting place to dwell. That's where art dwells, is not at those extremes of utter conviction, but in these places where, ooh, it's really complicated. And I can't, if I'm honest with myself, I can't take refuge in the idea that I'm completely right and that the other side is completely wrong. So that's where that came from. There was a certain program to pushing back against all kinds of political pieties.
So then, flash forward 2 or 3 years, I met you, heard you read the early section of the Corrections, Alfred in the Basement, and Enid on the cruise ship. The latter was a double reading with you and David Wallace.
Oh, the Cafe Limbo.
Limbo, and then at KGB.
Right.
And David read the Phone Mask episode from Infinite Jest. Neither book had been published yet, but there you two, rock stars in the making, were reading from your unpublished works. And David, if I remember right, he was writing his piece on Dostoevsky. He had read the big Joseph Frank book on Dostoevsky. So did you guys talk about that connection? Or?
We did a little bit. I mean, he was, I'd gotten to Dostoevsky earlier. He was really hung up on, he underlined the sentence in one of his letters, Dostoevsky was a beast. And I was like, well, he wasn't a beast. He was kind of, he was kind of messed up, but he had some problems. He was not a beast. So it was more at that level of my sticking up for, I mean, David, I think David revered that work, but then read the biography and was really turned off. Subsequently sort of happened to me with Steinbeck, I'm sorry to say. But which is why I try not to read biographies of literary figures I admire.
But was there some sort of attempt, coming out of this hard moment when you were reading a lot of religiously inflected fiction and thinking along those lines, then I remember you saying, you got to read David Wallace's story in the Paris Review. It's the one where the guy gets a crush on the woman at a concert at some park in the Bay Area, and saying that this is religiosity in fiction done right.
Yeah.
What made you recommend that story? What is it that's there?
Well,
I'm easy on it, so I'm asking you.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read the story, but what I was talking about with Dave in general, that, there's a certain amount of religion that comes with being in recovery, as Dave was for most of his adult life. And I think, he identified as Catholic at one point. He prayed every night. So religion mattered to him, but he also had that Dostoevsky, well, let's just make the strongest case against. And for Dostoevsky, that was always about the suffering of children, which still is one of the powerful arguments against the existence of a loving God, is the suffering of innocent children. And he would go to the worst. I mean, in his brief interviews with Hideous Men, it's like, let's start with Hideous and see what we can do, what we can salvage for the religious view. And I think there was a certain amount of, he has to believe this because it's saving his life, quality of suasion in what he's writing, but also I think he pushes through in story after story, particularly in that book, through the very worst in human beings to these places where, okay, yes, and then what? What are we left with? And there is still this possibility of grace, and there is still this possibility of redemption, and precisely the utter solitude of the individual. It's been the business of religion to kind of invert the utter solitude of the individual into an emotional, oh my God, I'm really out into theological territory I don't want to be into, but there is something precisely, if you really, really are alone, and yet you feel, well, I'm not alone, that's the beginning of a religious feeling. And the way he got in that story and in other stories like it to that point of aloneness is through just absolutely beastly behavior.
But then in your own work, it seems to me, for most characters, it's really a non-issue, in frankly religious terms. Joey calls it a non-issue, except he has this vestigial connection to his Jewish heritage that comes up in Freedom. But for most of the characters...
He thinks it's a good way to annoy his Jewish mother, who is totally, totally thrown that all away. And like, maybe I can annoy her like this.
But is it fair to say that that's not really part of the horizon for most of the characters from your third novel on?
Well, not to talk more than we need to about Dave Wallace, but he did tell me once I had no comprehension of how moderate I was. I was complaining about certain addictions of mine, and he just sort of smiled and shook his head. And oh, yeah, you don't even know how moderate you are. And I think that's actually kind of true of me as a writer too. Is that I am a large audience writer, which is to say, I've been pushing it, and really in each book pushing it further into ever greater extremes of psychological violence. But in general, I don't live in a Beckett or a Wallace or a Dennis Johnson world of just being right at the edge of existence. My stories take place in a more frankly bourgeois kind of setting. Different flavors of that and different modalities of that, and not necessarily very much money, but still, it just doesn't. People don't get pressed into the corner to the point where they would have to, where theology would come in.
Right. Although,
because psychology is still with me, even out to these rather far extremes.
I don't think of you as a moderate in the sense that the unhappiness in your books is immoderate. The capacity for self-sabotage in your books is immoderate. The caring and and aggression of the narrator in the books is immoderate. But I know what you're saying. It kind of reminds me of Walker Percy, who was a frankly religious novelist. He thought that the real mystery was human unhappiness, which was obviously evident in bourgeois American society. These are people who don't have the basic reasons to be unhappy: starving, family dead in wars, disease, and they're so unhappy anyway. And the difficulty for him was to get through an ordinary 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the South. And for you, that's the stillness of a weekday non-hour in St. Jude. Do you think about, are you a diagnostician of bourgeois unhappiness, or that's what he called himself?
Well, he was Southern.
He was a doctor also.
And he was a doctor, exactly. Good point. Yes, whereas I'm a Midwestern German major. Shout out to any German majors in the audience. Gotta like the class size. No, I see myself as an entertainer. I like to laugh. I like to cry. Reading a book doesn't happen very often. Laughing happens more often than crying. If somebody can do both, I become that person's bitch. They really kind of own me as a writer. And so what follows from that? I'm trying to tell a good story. And
unhappy people, moderation, diagnostician.
Well, moderation, yeah. The moderate has only to do with I know some really immoderate people. Wallace was one of them. Bill Vollman, who will type for 18 hours. Or will read for 3 hours a 500-page novel and be done with it and have it memorized. I mean, I know some really extreme people among my writer peer friends. So I think of myself as, he's the guy who people actually buy his books and you can get them at the airport, that kind of thing. But no, of course, when you're trying to tell a story, you're trying to tell a strong story. You're trying to really, you want the first page to, or at least the 5th page, to grab the reader. I like to be grabbed, and so you get to unhappiness not as a subject to be diagnosed, but as the fact that, well, if everyone is happy, there is no story. And it's as simple as that. No entertainment without unhappiness. The novel wouldn't exist if people didn't make mistakes. And really good novels wouldn't exist if people didn't really make terrible mistakes. There's almost nothing as delicious to read about as someone making a terrible mistake.
Schadenfreude is the...
It's not even Schaden, no, it's not Schadenfreude, it's just like, it's like that's instant sympathy. Because we've all made a mistake, and we all know, to sort of be granted this omniscient perch up there with the author of seeing, oh no, she's going to make a terrible mistake. That's just like, that's storytelling. That's great to watch. And you also, it's just some characters on a page that is literal, it's some letters on a page. And if you're reading a book that's working for you, you feel sympathy with this character who's really just made up out of verbs, vowels and consonants. And where is that coming from? It comes from another really good way to do it. First sentence. He owed $100 to X and wasn't sure how he was going to pay it. It's like, I'm interested.
Because I've been there, is that?
Well, no, I am a really old-fashioned Midwesterner, and never owe money to anyone was drummed into me from an early age, although I did end up owing my mother $3,000 once at the end of 1993. But no, it's just that that's part of how the deal is sealed. The contract is sealed in realistic fiction, is through sympathy for the characters, identification with the characters. And there are a few things. If the character wants something, if the character is making mistakes, those are pretty much the two big ones. If you can build that in, there's just this kind of magic. Even though I have just written these words on the page and someone else is reading them, it's like, oh, I'm interested.
Then part of the power of fiction, and I guess the human power of it, is our, I don't want to say ability, our propensity to identify with people who are very unlike ourselves, Mickey Sabbath or Lily Bart or some other total creep, and that we see the essential humanity, or we see our own inhumanity in them.
Right. Not to get too racy here at Georgetown, but Mickey Sabbath, disgusting old goat. And yet,
Philip
when he
Roth's novel Sabbath Theater.
Sabbath Theater, my favorite of his books after Goodbye Columbus. You know, and you're thinking, oh my God, he's insufferable, but he can't help himself. He's got pictures of he's down and out. He's staying with this guy, and gets shown to the guest room. Please take a bath, Mickey, you stink. And he's like, okay, takes a bath, and he just sees some pictures of the guy's daughter, who's like 19. It's like, yeah, I'll take those in the bathroom with me. And things go from there until the host barges in and sees the entire tableau. And suddenly I like Mickey, because it's like, oh my God, that is so horribly embarrassing. That is such a bad mistake you just made. Like not locking the bathroom door, just among many other mistakes. Yeah, that's right. And same thing with Lily Bart. It's like, just say the nice thing to Percy Grice or whatever his name is, and everything will be cool. Can't do it. Can't do it. So I love her.
I know, and your novels are tremendously entertaining, and that you have found that large audience, and it must be so gratifying. I know just as a reader, it's gratifying to know that others that were reading the same books. But there are these interpretive keys, often in the titles. I mean, freedom, I feel it as a novel mainly about your freedom as a writer to just let it rip for 550 pages, but not just let it rip. But.
No, I'm saying almost no one got that about that title.
That book feels so free. This book about the consequences and perils of our freedom, and the way these characters who are free to choose badly, or wish they didn't have to choose at all, or face unintended consequences of their freedom. But yeah, your freedom in that novel. You've written, your piece on autobiographical fiction is really the best piece of writing on writing I've read in recent years. That's in Farther Away. It's an extraordinary piece because you both, outfox the presumed interviewer by switching the terms of the question, and then show that your own way of looking at it is so much deeper than the way it's usually asked. But what you say, in effect, is to write a new book, you have to become a new person in some way. Because you wrote your best book that the last person could write. Here, I don't want to put your words in my mouth. Am I getting you right?
Yeah, it starts with the observation that people don't have time to read very many novels now. And from that I get, so if not as a matter of self-interest, then as a matter of consideration, I should try to write a really good novel if I expect a reader to use some of that very, very limited reading time to read it. And in fact, I should try to write the best thing I've got. And if I do that, if I like hold nothing back, there may come a time in the future. Did there come a time? Yes, there did come a time when I wanted to write another novel. Well, already did everything I had. I tried to put it all in that book. Now, it's possible there were some little odds and ends I missed, and my books have a way of being started out of the sweepings from the trimming floor of the previous books. Just little rinds that didn't make it in, but that still have a bit of cheese on them. It's always disgusting to talk about cheese. It's such a bad word, really, cheese. And cheesy is correspondingly such a beautifully conceived word. No, so where to go if you want to keep writing, if you want to keep being a novelist? And you don't want to repeat yourself, because that would be bad, and that would also seem to indicate that you actually hadn't written the best novel you possibly could, or that you were willing to put out inferior copies to waste the pressed for time reader's time. So yeah, the idea, that's the little backstory, which is a cultural context. Might have mattered less in the 19th century when everyone needed novels constantly. They were done with one on Tuesday and they were done with another on Thursday, and give me something. It doesn't even have to be Dickens's best, just give me more Dickens, I want more Dickens, or whatever. There's really, I mean, it becomes almost self-evident to write something with an edge that actually, oh, and there's another piece of it. So that's the kind of cultural context. There's also another prejudice of mine that writing shouldn't be a performance. It's not just me telling you what I know and what I think you should know, and it's really, really not telling you what opinions you should have on certain subjects, political and otherwise, because I want you to have the same opinions as me. So novel as propaganda, and it is a problem these days, as things become ever more political and polarized, to try to hold that position of, no, that's not what a novel's for. What is a novel for? The ones I respond to, I have the sense that the writer didn't know what they were getting into, that they were finding something, they were finding things in themselves, and they were also, they were working something out. They were being driven by something that was not figured out, and the way they were figuring it out was through the manipulation of these symbolic objects known as characters. And not to say they were trying to solve their life problems, but it's like, okay, I'm anxious about this, I'm going to create a character who's anxious like this, and I'm conflicted about this. Maybe I can find a story that will embody something like that conflict. I don't know why I'm going to do that. It's probably not going to help me solve that conflict, but at least it'll feel good. It might feel good to somebody else who has a conflict like that. This is the contract that the reader and the writer have. So you can smell in an author's oeuvre when stuff no longer seems urgent in that way. When it becomes a performance, a thing, well, I'm very good at telling a story, and I heard this story, somebody told me, and I'm just going to do a nice job of telling it. Great, but where are you? Where's your skin in the game? So there's a wish to have skin in the game. So if you've used up everything you've got, and you also insist that you've got to be working through something, it has to actually be alive for the writer. It has to really matter. It has to come out of some lack of resolution in the writer's own life. Then you really are forced to the conclusion that to write another book, you have to be a different person. That's a long and possibly opaque unpacking of what you asked me to unpack.
It's super powerful. It's meant so much to me. I guess it reminds me of something else that's been important in your work, which is the way, I think it's safe to say that falling in love with birds made you a different person in a certain sense.
Yeah, I got some good nonfiction out of that, certainly.
But also this whole sense.
Bad. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
Some good nonfiction came out of that experience.
Well,
becoming happy for a brief time Feeling for some months that I could relax and just enjoy life a little bit. Did not have to be driving myself relentlessly. Certainly, finally, not for money, but also I no longer had the sense that I was under-recognized. If anything, I felt over-recognized. So being able to relax on those things and just say, you know, I'm just going to go birding today and be okay with that. And to find myself spending more and more time in California, which I'd always made fun of as a place where people went and their brains rotted. I learned that it's not true. People actually, they have unrotted brains in California. And I've done all of my best work in California. But nevertheless, that you could go and be in a place that was pleasant. You know, Santa Cruz is a nice town. That felt like something different. And certain things immediately changed. Like, it became harder to be funny because I couldn't be as angry, and nothing makes good, really, really good comedy like somebody being really angry, the writer being really angry. And so with the diminution of anger came a certain diminution in comedy. Satire completely fell away. Just like, partly because I just had lost all faith in my ability to know what was right and wrong, ultimately. Certain obvious things accepted. And the satirist has to know what's right and what's wrong and be making fun of what's wrong. So I couldn't do that anymore because I was a little happier. And then it's like, well, what are you going to do? What are you still in conflict or unsettled by? Where's the hot material? Well, that turned out to be, I'm going to have to go to some places inside me and to sets of memories and to certain experiences and certain characters that I really, really would have loved to never have to go back to. And I did that in freedom, and then I did it all the more in purity. And not telling stories, I mean, the corrections, there were some elements of real life in that. My father added degenerative brain disease, and some of the things he said in real life are actually in the book. My mother, on a bad day, looked a little bit like the mom in the corrections. But the two later books, there was almost nothing taken directly from life, and yet it felt like I was moving closer to writing about myself. That's the odd paradox, is that autobiography, the closer you get to the hard stuff, and this is actually an almost religious thought, it has to do with representations of God. It cannot be done directly. And the really, really hot stuff in a person, I don't think, can be approached directly. It's too hot. If nothing else, shame is going to flood in, and once shame hits the page, the whole thing starts stinking, and the reader runs from the room, and the writer runs from the room too, because it's like shame is icky on the page. So for many reasons, you can't write. The closer you get to the hot core, the harder it is to write about it directly. The more you have to sit there and wait for some things that are sort of like it, but not too on the money, to develop, and then you can pour all of that heat into those images, basically, into those symbols, and a character is a symbol, and into these psychological objects that get constructed, in my case, over a course of several years to try to be strong enough to bear up as vessels for stuff I could not write about directly. So that may be sort of so abstract, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions from the audience.
That's fascinating. I'm just listening and listening. We will go to the questions, but you finished that thought because it's really powerful.
I will say no more on that subject.
I was going to ask you about this. You have this really penetrating idea of two different ways of being an environmentalist, the Puritan way and the Franciscan way. And the Franciscan way is almost like the novelist's way, focus on the particularity of a species or a bird in front of you, instead of thinking about net carbon or something like that.
Right. Which I associate with a certain strain of apocalyptic Protestantism.
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry Earth.
Yes, that was one of my little quips, yes.
But what you said
If we
about...
don't mend our ways immediately, we will have a hellish future.
But what you said about fiction there is so... I'd be a fool not to kind of stop there and just... It's really powerful. I want to have Bishop Ty ask the first question. What will it be?
I thought we had an agreement I wouldn't ask the first question. But no, thank you. Just, Paul, no, one thing that struck me, I wanted to ask was, a little thing you talked about, or Paul quoted the thing about saved by literature, or saved by reading, saved by novels. My own life, I've found novels, I wouldn't say saved, but they've graced my life. There's been times when certainly things have given me insight into myself and often insight into others. And that's been from religious writers and non-religious writers. And I have a conviction that if somebody's really getting to the human thing, then it can speak. And it's, in my perspective, it's going deeper. It's opening up a deeper thing. But I was just struck by, when I was coming over, one of the articles I found was, I don't know, it may have been published, I'm sure it was published over here, but it was, The Guardian had it about a year for the first anniversary of the election of Trump, a piece you wrote.
The essay in Dark Times was...
Yeah, I don't know if people...
They called it something else, as The Guardian is wont to do, yes.
Yeah, but there was, towards the end of that, you have this notion that you wrote an article that was, an essay that was critical of, is it the Audubon Society? And then towards the end of it, you're beginning to be critical of yourself for maybe being overly critical. Okay. And there's a line, though, you say, but here's the one I want to ask you, the question. You describe yourself as a depressive pessimist, okay? And yet you want to allow people room for hope, that you maybe felt you had crushed hope at some level. Where would you point people for hope, or how do you... I know that, and you're not... Maybe you can't go direct. It's through the imagination, or it's analogically.
Well, just maybe I'll answer slightly obliquely, just picking up on more recent experiences of religion. I was in the Mediterranean in 2010, reporting on a terrible problem that Europe and North Africa have with killing tens or hundreds of millions of migrating birds every year, which we can ill afford to lose. And I spent quite a bit of time in Italy, and indeed went to Assisi because I'd become interested in St. Francis's vegetarianism and his great respect for birds and the stories that are handed down. Of course, these are not well-documented stories, but there are so many of them, and they're all so consistent that probably there's some truth to many of them. He came to preach, and the swallows were making a lot of noise, and he let the swallows have their say. Said, like, no, let's just listen to what the swallows are saying. Okay, now I'm going to say some stuff, and then a moment later, shut up, swallows, which itself is amazing that he's like, just imagine what it was like to be there. He's like talking to them as if they're listening to him. And of course, at least traditionally, they immediately just said, they zipped it. So great stories, and he was this, and in Italy, which is just about 20% of the Italian population, is just horrible when it comes to their treatment of animals. And just if you're a migrating songbird trying to get through Italy, good luck. You will not make it, probably. Mostly the flyways go around Italy because it's just, there are millions of people out there shooting anything that moves. It's really, really ugly. And to think that also, to my knowledge, the greatest spirit ever in terms of instant, total, insane sympathy for animals was an Italian. So I was very interested, and we went actually to we went to some of the sites, including the place where there's a little marker and a architectural structure where he did the sermon to the birds. Sermon to the birds, yeah. It's right across from a gas station and a busy road. It wasn't so so intense at the time. But really, where was I going in answer to this?
Hope.
Hope. Yeah. So it was the late Middle Ages, and health conditions were not very good. Sanitary conditions were not very good. People didn't live long. And to me, just the idea, he and his brothers, they had nothing. They'd taken vows of poverty. They were walking around singing, and they would pay attention to the birds. And it was all about what was right in front of you, and that there was something, no matter, I mean, they couldn't save the world at all, but they could be kind to what was right in front of them. And to me, as long as that is that's the great model, and that is that's a deeply Christian model, to just be kind to what's right in front of you. I think there's hope automatically in that. It's only when you try to intellectualize it and say, well, what does that give you hope for? Well, nah, that's not the point. The doing of it and the hope are the same thing, is what I would say. Anyway, ready for a lighter question? Another person right in the front row. Yes. Oh, Mike is going around.
Thanks. Hi, Deborah Tennant. I was really struck by your comment about not wanting to read the biographies of writers that you really admire. And you've probably been asked this question before recently, but couldn't resist. We're living in a moment unlike any I've ever experienced before, where there's a stampede to distance oneself from the work of people who are found to have done objectionable things, or even suspected of accused of having done objectionable things. And I just wondered, do you feel that there's a point at which the character of the artist and the work and the value of the art can be separated? Would you feel that there's a separation point based on how evil the action is, or is it?
It's a really good,
yeah.
It's a great question. I've written about this a little bit, and my conviction that the character of the work comes to reflect the character of the author. It's tautological, of course. If I deem work to have good character, if I think Faulkner's work has good character, I'm very inclined to read his biography in such a way as to demonstrate that Faulkner basically had good character. And conversely, if I'm down on Hemingway, I'm going to read Hemingway's biography in a way that makes me think, oh, what a jerk. So acknowledging that possible circularity of it, I do. Well, I'm going to come out strongly and say the work should be judged on its own merits. But I have an almost mystical belief in that if the work's being done well, it ought to be an ever clearer expression of the person making the work. And if that person is fundamentally dishonest or fundamentally instrumental in his use of other people, or is a raging misogynist, if the work's being, that person can't win, because if the work doesn't reflect that, that person's not doing the right work, because the work is supposed to reflect who you are. And if the work does reflect it, I mean, if he's doing that work, then he's going to be showing what an asshole he is. So I kind of feel like I'm sure there are exceptions, and there are certain kinds of brilliance, like Nabokov's brilliance. I don't think I would have liked Nabokov very much. I think a lot of people didn't like Nabokov very much, but what he did when he was on with language, a language he wasn't even born into, an acquired second language, what he did with that is just so phenomenally gorgeous. And the combination of his powers of observation, his humor and that amazing faculty with language. It's just like, I don't really care. I'm going to roll on my back and expose my belly and let Nabokov tickle it. You know, it's like I can't help it. It's just too good. So I think so. Exceptions are made for genius, and that actually goes back to the little argument that Wallace and I were having. Yes, but Dostoevsky was a beast, and it was at a certain point. I know, but genius exception here. Anyway, that just to slightly answer the question. Thank you for it. Yes, ma'am. You could just shout it out. It's a small room.
Thank you very much. This is related in a certain way, and that is, as a reader, when we read a novel and we encounter characters or a place or a time we haven't been before, we can have great empathy for that and suddenly see the world in a different way. And I would imagine that as a writer, that happens as well when you inhabit a character or a certain place or time. And one of the things that's been coming up in a similar way recently is this idea of, well, but that it's cultural appropriation if you are writing about something that isn't yours or what you grew up with. And I'm just curious, I've seen this in the last couple of decades, this kind of shift happening. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, one has to speak carefully or one will be run out of town the way Lionel Shriver was after her remarks in Australia a year or a little more ago. But yeah, the reductio ad absurdum is really you're only allowed to write autobiography. And even that, like anyone who's a junior in college can say, well, yeah, and how trustworthy are your memories? And what makes you think your self-knowledge is perfect? So pretty quickly you get to, you can't write anything if you follow that logic too far. And of course, as Jane Smiley has persuasively argued, and she's not the only one, but she's done it prominently, the novel was the liberal form. Political liberalism arose too uncannily at the same time as the novel to not be related to it. And what is liberalism? It's the ability to have empathy with people who are not like yourself. It's the antidote, it's the kind of Enlightenment antidote to tribalism and class privilege and so forth. And the novel was the great artistic vehicle for experimenting with empathy, learning how to imagine what it might be like to be, if you're in Dickens's London, you know, in the poorhouse. Great project, and again, and it's so deeply in the DNA of the novel, empathy, not only historically, but also in how it functions, that it does seem to be hobbling the novel to be allowed only to write about people who belong to your particular subset, intersecting subsets of identity, defined by somebody else, I would add. Nevertheless, we should be culturally sensitive. And I think everything in the liberal academy goes quickly to infuriating excess and outrageous just idiocy. But cooler heads can make the same point, and it's quite unobjectionable. If you're going to be writing about a Native American character, you kind of need to do better than he had red skin and had a feather in his hair. You know, you kind of like, you better really know your stuff, and ideally you should always be considering who might read the book. And I think that's the good argument at the center of all the talk about cultural appropriation. Is I think the bad version is just don't do it. I think you should be allowed. These are works of imagination, and as I said, I think straightforward autobiography, this is what happened to me, that's, my God, the whole game is over if that's all we can do. Because autobiography, you actually have to make stuff up. You have to imagine things. You have to invent things. And And inevitably, unless you're inventing anything but yourself, you are going to be doing some sort of appropriation of experiences you've had of other kinds of people. So you should be allowed to do that, but you should also be aware of who might read the book. And I think, I've been reading people, I think the cultural conservatives read in the New York Times, oh, now you can't publish a children's novel with someone who's not a white character unless you get to kind of vetted by experts. And they're saying this is deplorable. It's like, no, it's not deplorable. I mean, if the person actually needs to have, probably a lot of those writers could use some sensitivity training. I would welcome, case in point. So I do female characters, although I am emphatically only 48% female. And sometimes I get it wrong, and I have two layers. I have three people who read stuff as section by section as I'm writing it. Two of them are women, and it will happen that they say, nah, you got that wrong. And like, it would be idiotic in 12 different ways for me to ignore that and say, no, then I would be doing something. But to listen and say, OK, I'd like to get it right. But someone who would take away from the right to do a female character, well, then I would have to object to that. Maybe we can take one more question, because I know we're way over the time here, but I do enjoy these. And sorry to anyone whose question I didn't get to. No, you had your hand raised. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So as a faculty member in the German department, I just cannot resist, since you since you mentioned that you were or have been a German major. So specifically, I know you studied German, you've lived in Germany, you have a huge...
I've translated Karl Kraus.
Exactly. So, and the awards that President De Gioia read, two of them were from Germany for your works. I'm sitting next to my colleague here for Italian, so I want to have it a little broader than just German. But what does your familiarity with other, specific deep familiarity, let's say, with German and German culture, but also, French, I guess, and Italian and so forth. How does that inform your writing about, on your observations about American society? What do you think that brings to it or contributes to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got that much from reading. One of the reasons I became a German major, apart from lack of any other option that my parents would have been okay with, was that I got to go to Germany for a year, and then I got a Fulbright, so I was able to spend a second year in Germany. So in my late teens, early 20s, I spent 2 out of 3 years not in this country, and I think that, and that was why it was great to be, and that still applies for language majors. It's a great excuse to go abroad. But inevitably, having spent all that time out of the country, I came back, and the scales, in both cases, both after Munich and after Berlin, I saw this country so much more clearly, because I saw the things that, it was an early lesson in what we now call how socially constructed things are. Things that you take for granted. Just little things, the way little things happen, even right down to which side of the road you drive on. All of these things, to be aware that the stuff that you grew up in and thought was just the way the world was are actually quite contingent. That's eye-opening for a young person, eye-opening for anyone, but it was kind of revelatory for me. And I think something of this sort also happens at the literary level, that the more familiarity you have with other literatures, ideally in their own original language, again, you become aware of a certain amount of contingency. In my case, you also become aware of how lucky you are to get to write in English, because it is so efficient and it has like so many more words than almost any other language. It's just like, because it comes from so many sources and it's such a happening now language. that's all, really. Except that I wish, I think it'll be sad. I'm going to be sad when it comes time to die. But in certain ways, I think I'll be tired and maybe feel like I've done a lot of things and don't need to do any more, let somebody else do some things. But it will be a regret if I never learn Russian to read the Russians in Russian. And I did find in German that I have a different, what I think of as Rilke, what I think of as Mann, what I think of as Kafka is not the same as people who only read them in translation is. That there is particular levels of humor that you just don't get unless you're reading it in German. So that's a strong argument for reading in the original if you can, and for taking modern languages. And that's all I've got to say. And Paul has been absolutely wonderful. President Joya, thank you. Been a great audience, and I feel I've gone on far too long, and I'll shut up now. Thank you. Thank you.